Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the Australia Institute's Democracy Agenda for the 47th Parliament. I'm Bill Browne, the head of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability program. Thank you all for coming, and a special thank you to Helen Haines, Zali Steggall and Rebekha Sharkie for joining us to help launch the agenda. I'll be speaking first, giving a short introduction to the report, and then in order we'll have Helen Haines, the independent member for Indi, Zali Steggall, the independent member for Warringah, and Rebekha Sharkie, the Centre Alliance member for Mayo. So if everyone is ready, we can kick off now. The Democracy Agenda for the 47th Parliament is a collection of proposals to improve parliamentary... The Democracy Agenda for the 47th Parliament is a collection of proposals to improve parliamentary practices, government accountability, and public participation in our democracy. Each proposal in the agenda warrants serious consideration by the next Parliament, the 47th since Federation. Not all of the proposals will be able to be implemented on day one. In fact, doing so would go against our proposal for legislation to have more time for deliberation. However, taken as a whole, the proposals are a vision for Australian politics done differently, with more transparency, accountability, and responsiveness to the public. A particular priority is better funding for our accountability institutions, including for reviews of freedom of information requests and the Auditor General's ability to perform more performance audits of how government money is spent. Concern about worldwide democratic backsliding and a lack of engagement here at home is what prompted the Australia Institute to establish the Democracy and Accountability program last year to research solutions to the problems that bedevil our democracy. And of course, it is thanks to minor parties and independents that many Australians have re-engaged with politics, which is why I'm so thankful to be joined for the launch of the Democracy Agenda by Helen Haines, Zali Steggall and Rebekha Sharkie, 3 members of the Crossbench. Thank you. And should mention we'll be open for questions at the end. I'd now like to hand over to Helen Haines.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I thank Bill and the Australia Institute for the work they've done on this important report. Bill mentioned doing politics differently. That's a signature call from the communities of Indi, who since 2013 have asked that we have a better standard of politics and to enable that to happen, have elected an independent member of Parliament. It's a great privilege for me to be the independent member for Indi and to make these calls for doing politics differently, for having a stronger and more vibrant democracy and a Parliament that has greater transparency and accountability. Our democracy is our nation's greatest asset, and any erosion to our democracy is a threat to our very way of life. I've been a champion in this place from the day I arrived for a Federal Integrity Commission with teeth. I've seen that as a fundamental bedrock to ensure that we have the transparency and accountability in this place, that our leaders are held to account in a way that gives trust to the Australian people. We've seen time after time a disappointing array of decisions, announcements, policy agendas, funding rounds that have in fact eroded our democracy. It's only with a strong Federal Integrity Commission that we can hold our leaders to account. It's why I introduced to this Parliament the Australian Federal Integrity Commission Bill 2021 and again in 2022. An election promise of the highest order has been broken by Scott Morrison when it comes to integrity in this place. So it's timely that here, on the very last day of the 47th Parliament, that we're reflecting on our democracy. And we have here a report that puts forward solid, good ideas with the intention of making our democracy stronger and making our parliament not only a better place to drive the nation to the future that we deserve, but a better place to work as well. I really am pleased to be here today and to speak to this, and I will give my guarantee to the people of Australia that if I'm re-elected to this parliament for the 47th parliament, you won't hear the end of it when it comes to a Federal Integrity Commission. I will fight every day until we get one.
Thank you. It is important that on this, the final day of the 46th Parliament, that we talk about how can we do this better. Is our current process in Parliament working for the Australian people? Are we increasing trust in government or is it decreasing? Because at the moment, the numbers are dire. The indication is people on the street do not trust government. Their faith in government, in processes, is falling. And it is our duty to pull that up. We need to do better. Our business, our institutions all have a responsibility to have an assessment of their processes, to assess if it's working and to do better. And so I thank the Australian Institute for this very comprehensive and important report to talk about, is our democracy working? Are our processes here in Parliament working? And the recommendations are broad. It is from the practical, procedural aspect of how Parliament works, like question time, like the process of bringing bills on for debate and a vote. Helen Haines, we had a very important vote in relation to the Federal Integrity Commission proposal, which was defeated on a technicality, whereby the current rules provide for an absolute majority in circumstances where it is all but impossible. It should be a bare majority. It should be a majority of MPs on the floor in the House for private members' bills or suspension of standing orders to occur. At any one time, the major parties can have up to 8 paired MPs. That means up to 16 people will be missing from the Parliament by agreement between the major parties. And so an absolute majority of 76 is simply not going to be achievable. I think the code of conduct of members of Parliament is sorely lacking. As an ex-sports person, I find it incredible that we hold athletes up for bringing a sport into disrepute, and yet here we are in Parliament where we are supposed to set the example. We are passing the laws that will regulate the lives of millions of Australians, and we have no such code of conduct. Ministers have a ministerial code, but it is questionable how that is applied, and it is so discretionary that I would argue it is all but ineffective. I absolutely am convinced we need a strong code of conduct here in Parliament for members of Parliament, for staff, and in particular for heads of department as well. We have a duty to the Australian people to uphold the highest standard possible. Another area I think has been very concerning is the rise of corruption and allegations of misspending of public funds. And this interlaps with the question of donations and money in politics. It is incredibly important that when we talk about reform, that we really look at what influence is bought. I strongly advocate for a declaration by ministers of their conflicts of interest where public money is being allocated for companies or contracts to companies that have made donation. There should be an arm's length independent commission to assess the process and make those recommendations. I think it is incredibly important that Australians can have confidence that decisions are being made on merit and in the best interest of the community, not political parties. And finally, I very much support that we bring about reforms to question time and increase, for example, the number of sitting days in Parliament. Australian people have serious questions. They have serious issues that need debating, that need addressing here in this place. And yet, time and time again, we are, I would argue, wasting a lot of time on games, on Dorothy Dix's In Question Time, where it's all about actually avoiding the debate, avoiding answering questions, rather than being truthful to the Australian people and providing answers. In this 46th Parliament, we have spent more than 1.5 times of our votes on gagging debate. Now, this is the House of Representatives is a chamber of debate, and yet the government's priority has been on at an incredible ratio about gagging debate, shutting down debate. I do not think that is a meaningful or responsible use of public money and time in this place. We are here to improve the lives of Australians, not just advance gag debate. So there's a number of incredibly important recommendations, and I think it befalls every MP that is seeking re-election for the 47th Parliament to be committed to doing things better. Thank you.
Thanks, Zali. Well, on Tuesday night, when people were looking at their own wallet and wondering how the budget was going to affect them, the Liberal Party was stuffing their wallet in this place, with every inch of this place having a political fundraiser. And that's all for the election. Now, I believe this place should not be used for party political fundraising. It doesn't happen in the South Australian Parliament. The Western Australian Parliament has very tight rules, and it's about time that this Parliament does too. We need to clean up this place. We need to improve this place. And that's why I support the recommendations made by the Australian Institute. And I'd like to thank them for the great work that they've done here. And while I have this platform, I also want to talk about another area we need to clean up. There are some amendments coming down today from the Senate with respect to aged care, also about transparency and requiring the aged care providers to open up their books and tell us what they spend on aged care, and also for us to have registered nurses. So, to those who are government MPs who are watching this press conference right now, I would urge you to vote in favour of these amendments that came down from the crossbench. The crossbench has been doing all the heavy lifting in this place, in this Parliament and the previous Parliament. And I do hope the Australian people will allow us to do that into the future, because the two major parties have time and time again ganged up to erode political donation law and to make sure that this place doesn't improve. Thank you.
Will this report and its recommendations be an opening demand in negotiations after the election in the event of a hung parliament? And which side would the crossbenchers speak to first on these and other demands?
We had money on how quickly that question would be asked.
Only that it's the only way, it's the most likely way that it would be advanced.
No, look, I don't deal in speculatives, and at this point, I'm committed to the job of representing the people of Warringah and getting re-elected. For me, it's important to advance the issues on which I stand, and they will be my priority to ensure the people of Warringah are best represented. These are just some of the changes that should be implemented. I would argue that these should not be a question of, this should be bipartisan. All members of this place should be focused and prioritising on delivering a better democracy.
Could I just add to that? One of the recommendations is around private members' business and the capacity to vote on private members' bills. So I think an opportunity is provided through the recommendations in this document that should we be in a situation where there are more people on the crossbench, then that opportunity to push forward for reform, whether that be through motions, whether that be through legislation, whether that should be or could be through a parliamentary committee process to bring about reform to our democracy, is a real opportunity in the 47th Parliament.
And I'd just say, we don't need a hung parliament to make this work. What we need are willing major parties. And I would urge both Liberal and Labor to read this document and commit to these recommendations, because it will benefit all of us. Thank you.
This report includes a recommendation for increasing the size of Parliament by 50% in line with the Australian population. What would that mean for the crossbench and its ability to get these kinds of reforms passed, and would that dilute the voices of the crossbench in being able to ask questions and see change?
Happy to have a go at that one. That's a big ask to increase the Parliament by 50%. But let's look at a hypothetical if that was to ever happen. Right now, what we're seeing is an Australian public who are seeking a better standard of politics, and they're looking to the independent movement to do that. They're looking to the crossbench to do that. I think if we were ever to have an increased number of parliamentarians in this House, you could expect there would be more crossbenchers, and with more crossbenchers, I think we'd see more reform.
Another one of the recommendations was from the Greens to give Parliament the right of consent for war powers. As members of the crossbench, do you feel that Parliament should have that right? And where would you vote if Parliament was given the right to decide on conflict in Ukraine and Taiwan?
So, people in my community have found it extraordinary that there is no debate with respect to sending troops anywhere in the world, Australian troops anywhere in the world. And I think we actually just need to have the debate and the conversation. We find out as members of the crossbench when it's on the news, and really this is a critical issue that should be discussed in the Parliament. I don't have all of the detail with respect to Ukraine or with respect to Taiwan, simply because there is no debate, there is no statement made by the Minister, and no recourse.
I agree with Rebekha on this issue. It's quite astounding that the Prime Minister can send our sons and daughters to war without any real accountability or transparency or debate around that process. I think it is appropriate for a democratic nation to have a process by which there is debate and disclosure of the case for participation before the representative chamber, which is the House of Representatives here in Parliament. I strongly support that any declaration of participation in war should be via a debate through the chamber. In relation to the current conflicts, as Rebekha said, there is simply no appropriate disclosure of facts and defence scenarios and implications for us to be able to. That would be dealing in speculatives.
One more. If you extend Parliament to 26 weeks and you reduce the number of hours, that's the implication in the report, of the average sitting day, what will that mean? And I note that we've got 3 female members of the crossbench here. What will that mean for instance, the reforms that were proposed in the Jenkins report?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really important that we look to the Jenkins review in its total recommendations, and one of them was around working conditions in the Parliament. The Parliament consists of us as parliamentarians, but all our staff. And to put forward a recommendation such as this is to recognise that the working hours are horrendous and are not in any way conducive to strong physical, mental or family health. So I think it's a recommendation that certainly deserves merit. I think it's one that could be achieved. I would certainly support it. Coming to Parliament for an additional 6 weeks per year, though, does hold some challenges, of course, particularly for our parliamentarians and their teams who come from Western Australia or come from any city, really, in the nation, Northern Territory, where there's long travel periods of time. So I think in any discussion about this, we need to find the balance, but there should be a discussion. It shouldn't just be cast aside and it's business as usual. We certainly don't want to see this Parliament behave in a business as usual manner, and the Jenkins review is an important, I think, a watershed document that I want to see those recommendations implemented.
If I could add, there's a lot of debate at the moment in the news about the character of the Prime Minister and conduct. And I would argue that one example of autocratic and I would say bullying agenda was the debate we had around the religious discrimination bill, where the government insisted that the Parliament sit until 5 a.m. from the previous day to attempt to pass a very difficult and a bill that was very difficult and a very at times emotional debate. Now, there was no reason or urgency for that debate to need to go to 5 a.m. through the night. And this isn't a comment I make as an MP myself. I'm quite happy to sit through the night personally. That is a commitment I'm happy to make. But it's for the staff of this house, the security, my team that was in my office, the clerks in the chamber. They all had to be at the whim, essentially, of the Prime Minister to enable that debate. Now, this was not a declaration of war. This was not an urgent legislation. This was a legislation that the Prime Minister had had 3 years to bring forward for debate, but in the dying days of this Parliament, debated to make this his priority and insist that it be debated through the night. In contrast, what we could have done would be schedule further sitting days, and that is entirely within the government's purview to do. And so I would argue that recognising, as Kate Jenkins has in her report, we set the standards, that there are a respectful workplace is one that respects that there is a work-life balance for staff. It is one that respects that just an autocratic desire to push an outcome does not outweigh the priorities and other responsibilities. I accept that in times of emergency, it is a different scenario. But when it is not a situation of emergency, that shouldn't be the case. Through COVID, we've seen an ability by government, institutions, businesses, processes to adapt. We have seen new ways of doing business. We have asked our communities and businesses to work from home, to invest in more flexible measures, to become more digital. And yet here in this place, we are stuck in another century. The Parliament was able, with bipartisan, to agree for the first time to remote participation to Parliament. And now that was through the imperative of COVID. There needs to be a constant review of how do we adapt the processes of this place to this century, to the standard we expect of our business communities and everyone out there in the public. And there's a number of recommendations here that are trying to drag this Parliament and the processes of this place to the standard we expect in the private sector.
Has the Prime Minister's dealings with the crossbench MPs been of an appropriate standard? Has there been problems there, as other MPs in the Parliament have expressed this week?
Look, I certainly cannot speak for others. My meetings with the Prime Minister have at all time been professional, but I would make note of his conduct in question time and in the chamber, the use of gagging debate, and the I would say habit he has of turning his back on those of the opposition or the crossbench. These are not traits or traits that show respect. And I think as Prime Minister of a nation, you have a duty upon you to be of a higher standard and to show respect for all. Whether you agree with their viewpoint or not, respect is something that should come from the highest office.
Helen Haines and Rebekha Sharkie, do you share the same sentiments about the Prime Minister's behaviour?
Look, I think Zali's hit it on the head with respect to conduct in the chamber. My meetings with the Prime Minister have always been professional. However, it does gall me when I see anyone who is sitting at the table, anyone who's sitting at the box, turning their back and playing on their phone. I think that we can lift all of ourselves up much higher with respect to conduct in the chamber, and particularly during question time. I think we can do much better, no matter who the Prime Minister is. And I note that I've sat in 2 parliaments now, and this behaviour seems to be particularly obvious in this parliament.
Look, again, it seems that we have the same experience. My dealings with the Prime Minister have always been professional, but I think what the nation sees largely is behaviour in question time, and this report talks about reform to question time. It shouldn't take a report, it shouldn't take a set of guidelines and recommendations for any leader to know how to behave respectfully in a private situation or in a public situation. So I echo the calls from my colleagues that I think we could see a whole better standard of behaviour in the chamber, and most particularly at question time when the nation seems to be watching them.
What would
the three of you say about the Prime Minister's character? Is there anything you would add just about it generally?
No. Because I am concerned that we are in an era where we have great challenges ahead. We have communities devastated by floods. We've had communities devastated by bushfires. We are at a time in history, we're at a crossroad. We have important choices to be made. It is incredibly important to be working collaboratively with our international partners, to gain respect from international partners, to be in a more secure world, and we're seeing world conflicts erupt. And I think for that, your character and how you are viewed becomes incredibly important. And I can't ignore the number of allegations by people that have worked closely with the Prime Minister. We have from the previous Prime Minister, from the Deputy Prime Minister. We have from people that have worked within the coalition party room. We now have from the Senator and crossbench senators. And we have from international leaders like the French President. And I don't think that reflects well on Australia, and I don't think that reflects well on our government or advance the interest of Australia with our international allies. So it does cause me great concern, the level of mistrust and the doubts in relation to the Prime Minister's moral compass as they're raised by these allegations. And I should say, in the context of the Kate Jenkins review and the Set the Standard, for example, or implementing the full recommendations of the Respect at Work report, there has been a reluctance to engage with, by the Prime Minister, with increasing accountability and increasing protections for such standards. I can give my own example. I introduced the Stop the Lies Bill to stop lying in political advertising. I introduced that with plenty of time for it to be enacted and in effect for this coming election. But there is no desire to be held to a higher standard by the political parties in this place. The Prime Minister point blank said to me in question time, he does not think there is a problem with politicians and parties being able to openly lie to the voting public in political advertising. Now, that is a standard that we do not allow businesses to have. Businesses are held to a standard higher than that. And I think at a time where there is an erosion in trust in politics, an erosion in government, we have a duty to absolutely improve that. So I strongly urge that we need to stop the lies in political advertising. We need to hold the Prime Minister to a higher standard of character.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone.